Nate, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. We've been so excited to talk to you, and we're just really grateful that you're here. So, welcome.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with something that you wrote in a piece that I love about this concept of studying it out. Because I think a lot of times when I have a big question or I have a question that's like causing some fear, that some part of my brain says just let it be. And so I really appreciated your approach to this idea of revelation and that studying it out and experiencing a stupor of thought, like that's all part of how we receive revelation. So before we jump into what feels like one of these topics that can be hard to talk about, I'd love for you to just set the stage and talk about why you feel like we really have permission to just dig in and try to figure out hard things.
I'm always struck by the section of the Doctrine and Covenants that talks about revelation as you study things out in your mind, and then you ask if it is correct. And then if you have a stupor of thought, the stupor of a thought is like the Lord giving you an answer to something. There's a sort of sequence in the scriptures there, which is like study, ask, stupor. But I think the process of revelation, oftentimes, like the order of things gets changed around. And we could use other examples where people are confused about things, and then they think about the things that they're confused about. And the fact that they're confused about them leads them to go and seek further revelation. So the stupor of thought and the thing that is really troubling can be a sort of prelude to revelation. There's a great example of this, I think, from the life of the prophet Joseph Smith. As I understand some of his thought, he was concerned because he read these passages in the New Testament that said, in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, everybody needs to be born of water and of the Spirit. So everyone need to be baptized. And he'd received a revelation that said, well, baptisms that aren't performed by the power of the Melchizedek priesthood are invalid. And this was deeply, deeply troubling because it seemed to suggest that most of humanity was going to be damned, unable to receive salvation. And that was concerning to Joseph Smith. So I think there's a sense in which he was looking at a clear teaching of the Savior in the New Testament. He was looking at revelations that he'd received, and then there were some troubling implications for those. And then he was thinking more and searching more, and then we get the revelation of the idea of work for the dead. So I do think that being troubled by things, that's part of revelation. I'll say also early on in my life, I got two pieces of sort of intellectual advice that have always stuck with me. So when I was younger and had more hair, I decided that I wanted to be a professor and an academic, and that I was interested in trying to integrate my religious faith and my experience and thought as a Latter-day Saint with my legal studies that I do. So I'm interested in legal thought, but I was interested in how does religion inform that legal thought? And in the Mormon tradition and my own faith, where is sort of law intersected with Mormonism? And sometimes that has created, places where there's sort of scandalous troubles. So I was looking for older and wiser people to give me advice on this. And because I had enormous amounts of unearned confidence, I actually sent a letter to then Apostle Dallin H. Oakes, because he had been a very prominent law professor, and I thought he was a very serious legal intellectual. He was a very well-regarded legal scholar before he became president of BYU. And so I asked him in my letter, how do I integrate religious faith into an academic career as a law professor? And he wrote me back. And the response he gave back to me, which has stuck with me, is he said, when you're thinking about these intellectual issues, the most important thing that you can do is actually make sure that that is not your only diet. Make sure that you are living in such a way that you have these aren't the literal words that Elder Oaks used, then Elder Oaks used, but you should make sure that you're reading your scriptures, that you're serving the church, that you have a devotional life. You have a big spiritual sort of hinterland that's not just these issues that you're focusing on. And I've always stuck with me that it's really important to do the sort of boring and ordinary things because that gives you ballast in your spiritual life. And that's something when I'm in a stupor of thought, I come back to that a lot, that it's important that you have a spiritual life that includes lots of things. The other great piece of advice I got was from Richard Bushman. And Richard Bushman told me, when you're dealing with an intellectual issue, particularly an intellectual issue with regards to the gospel and the church and church history, what Richard said is he says, always go for the jugular. Always go for the jugular. Go straight at what you think the main problem is. If there's something that's troubling you, Don't just let it sort of hover in your
Wow.
consciousness as a sort of dark cloud. Figure out what it is that's troubling you and articulate it, if only to yourself, what it is.
Yeah.
And then once you've articulated what it is, and you can articulate precisely what it is about this thing that bothers you, lay out what are the different options that you would have about how you could deal with that, how you would think that through. And to me, those two pieces of advice are the piece of advice that I've had in my life for thinking about what it means to study something out when you're in a stupor of thought, right? Is make sure that you have some spiritual ballast in your life. And then if you've got something that you're troubling and you're mulling over, go for the jugular, figure out exactly what it is, articulate it, and then think through how you would respond to those things. And I think that's part of the process of revelation. I don't think that's like some intellectual thing that professors do. And I
Yeah.
think that's part of how God speaks to people. It's not the only way that God speaks to people, but I think it's part of how God speaks to people.
Yeah, well, that is such powerful advice. That's something I'm learning again and again, that that's actually that is a path to peace. Something about articulating the exact pain all by itself can really feel like such a relief. And I'm not sure what it is, if it's just like because it helps you accept that that's the experience and it's like a way to help to stop resisting it. But I love how we put that. I think that the elephant in the room then is, but what's your stewardship? Because I think that's the genuine argument that will come to mind, that like you might feel uncomfortable, but that's not yours to wrestle with or yours to change. And so when we're talking about the institution of the church, when we're talking about doctrines and policy, I think it can get really uncomfortable because there's this tension between personal revelation and prophetic leadership and revelation. And so it can be hard to understand your place there. So I think that's what was especially interesting to me, that you're studying out things that someone might put under the stewardship of prophetic revelation. So how do you see your place in an institution where you might be sensing serious discomfort about things that are outside of your stewardship?
So I am very comfortable with the notion that I have no authority or power whatsoever. I think that the world is actually a much better place because I do not have authority and power. So when I'm thinking about with regards to the church or church policies, I just am very comfortable with the notion that there are lots of things that these are not my decisions to make. So I am comfortable saying they're not my decision to make. I don't think that precludes someone from thinking and trying to think from a place of faith and testimony and love for the church and for the gospel to sort of think about certain kinds of alternatives that we can imagine. The danger with that project, it seems to me, is there is a danger of a kind of idolatry, right? Which is that you end up sort of falling in love with a version of the gospel that you make up. And one of the really powerful and central messages of the restoration is that we need help to get back to God. God has to reveal things to us. And one of the ways that he reveals things to us, it's not the only way he reveals things to us. And it's not an infallible channel of revelation, but is through the hierarchy of the church. And so I try to be cautious and try to have some humility about my own ideas and realize that I could be wrong about things.
Yeah.
The other way I think about it is as a Latter-day Saint, and I am a believing, practicing Latter-day Saint. I'm an early morning seminary teacher. I get up at 5 a.m. every
Right
morning.
now?
I'm a member of the church.
Oh, wow.
I'm committed to the church and to the gospel. And I understand part of my covenants is that I sustain the leadership of the church. And for me, sustaining means that I would never want to act in such a way that I would inhibit or undermine the ability of the brethren to carry out their stewardship over the church. So I would not want to speak in such a way that I would undermine their ability to have a righteous and positive influence in the world. And so I would be careful about sort of how I criticize things or how I would phrase my beliefs. I don't think that sustaining means that I believe that the brethren know everything, that everything that happens within the context of the church and in history is infallible or anything like that. And so I don't feel that disagreement or doubt or puzzlement about the church and about the actions of leaders, I don't see that as a failure to sustain them. I
Mhm.
would think it would be a failure to sustain them if my response to that would have the effect of inhibiting their ability to be a positive influence in the Lord's work. And so when I talk and think about these things, I'm careful that I wouldn't want to do something that would inhibit them. I will say there's one other thing that I do.
Yes, please.
I write letters. I write letters to the brethren. I'm sure they probably just send them to the recycle bin, and that's probably not a bad use of the letters. But I do think there's a really good spiritual and mental practice, which is that if someone says something that you find upsetting or troubling, it's very easy to your response to that just imagines that person is not in the room and I'm complaining about them to somebody else. And if you think about your interactions with people who hurt you or they say something that causes you concern, you speak and think differently when you're talking directly to that person.
Yeah.
And so I write letters to the brethren, and I've done so on occasion when there have been things I've not been thrilled about. And I think it's a very good practice to say, okay, what would I actually say to this person? And I want to speak to them in a way that's respectful, that is charitable, that tries to see the world as they're seeing the world. To the extent that I'm trying to articulate a different position, how would I articulate that position that's going to be persuasive and reasonable to that person? And the point of that exercise is less about being an advocate, because I don't have the ear of anybody and there's no reason I should. But I think that it's just better for your soul, right? When you are troubled by something, especially within the community of the church where we've taken covenants to bear up with each other, I just think it's better to your soul to figure out how would I address this to the person themselves in a way that's charitable and is generous and is respectful. And I just think that's better for your soul than
Yeah.
like bitching about people on the internet.
Yeah.
Say
Wow.
bitching about people on
Yeah.
the internet in this podcast?
Yes, you can say that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm thinking about we were building a house a year ago, and I remember we moved in, we'd maybe lived here for a couple of months, and my daughter, who was 6 at the time, maybe 7, I think she had just turned 7, she was walking by something in the kitchen and she's like, "Why is all that wood still here?" And I went down underneath the cabinets and realized there was this massive section of sheetrock that was completely open that was just under our line of sight that literally no one had noticed. And it was as soon as you look, it's so obvious. But from her perspective, it was like it was her exact eye line. And I think that's kind of how I started to think about sustaining that, I used to feel some guilt about ever noticing something that was causing discomfort or noticing something that I felt like we needed to wrestle with. But I think more and more I think of sustaining like what she did. Like, why are we doing it like that? And it was because I hadn't noticed. It was like there was an unfinished part of the house and I didn't realize it because I couldn't see it very well. And I think sometimes that's how I can show up as a disciple, like show up with my perspective and my whole heart and be willing to have those conversations. And as opposed to seeing that as an act of disobedience, it feels like that is how I sustain my church. This is how I sustain the leadership, and it's how I sustain this community. I show up with everything that I have, including my perspective, and speak up when I notice something that feels unfinished or that feels broken, even if I'm wrong. And you're very open about that. Like, these are my ideas. This is how I'm thinking about something. I might be totally wrong. And I think holding that with some openness sort of relaxes the conversation. But maybe the conversation itself is part of our discipleship and is good for us and good for our community and maybe for leadership too.
Mm.
So I appreciate that perspective. The other sort of stage setting question I wanted to ask you about is just this concept of evolving theology. I think that for me, it comes from an anxious place, but I think there's definitely an idea in our community that doctrine doesn't change, period. And so whenever we have hard conversations about history, that can feel like this very uncomfortable point of disagreement, maybe that I think there can be this real desire to prove that whatever changed, it wasn't the doctrine, that there's always
Mhm.
been a perfectly consistent thread that doesn't change. And so when we talk about ceilings, we get kind of creative about the ways that we keep that thread continuous so that we can stay in a safe place believing the doctrine never changes. You, I feel like, have described this in a different way that I think was really useful to me. And that is what seems like a fact to you, that theology is evolving. So could you just talk, I guess maybe to somebody who's closing up around that idea and resisting it, does our theology actually evolve?
So let me speak just really frankly as a
Okay.
believer with a testimony,
Okay.
right? The restoration is God working in the world. I think the gospel is God working in the world. And when I read the scriptures, the most important thing that I see in the scriptures is God working in the world. So, God in the book of Moses, he says, "Behold, this is my work and my glory to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man." So, what God forefronts, it seems to me in that revelation, is his actions in the world. And his actions in the world are about bringing his children exaltation and eternal life in his kingdom. So the way I think about it is God is acting in the world. God has always been acting in the world, and he acts in the world in lots of different ways. And one of the ways he acts in the world is through prophets. And these prophets then give to the people revelations. And the revelations we get from prophets tend to be things like scriptural texts, which are like the texts of Revelations. Oftentimes, they're like commands to do things, or they're projects to do things. We're going to, Heber J. Grant receives a revelation in the 1930s. We're going to create the welfare system. We're going to create this big institutional structure to help Latter-day Saints who are suffering economic distress. And we want that to be organized and effective. That's God working in the world. Theology is not God working in the world. Theology is how human beings make sense of God working in the world. So I think our theology is God is working in the world, and then we're sort of sitting back here watching God work in the world and saying, what's going on here? Like,
Wow.
what's happening?
Yeah.
How do I make sense of this?
Okay.
Right? And so theology is the way in which we try to make sense of God working in the world. And sometimes when we make sense of God working in the world, like I think we get things right. And so there are certain things we might say about God's work in the world that are like just really consistently true and right. Like I believe that the central way in which God works in the world is through sending his son Jesus Christ to be the atoning savior of mankind. And the working out of the atonement in the human story is God working in the world. And so then I have a theory about this, right? Like Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And Jesus Christ's sacrifice is this absolutely pivotal, necessary thing in the salvation of the human family. So, in that sense, like I believe there's theology that's unchanging. I would be
Yeah.
very, very shocked, and I can't imagine myself continuing to be a Latter-day Saint and then saying, well, I've received like a revelation, like I don't think
Yeah.
Jesus Christ is the savior of mankind anymore. But my theologies and doctrines, those are theories that come after the fact that are trying to make sense of God's work in the world. And they're useful, like they kind of orient us towards that work in various ways, and they might help us explain the work in ways that are attractive to people so that people want to get involved in God's work. We might just do it because it's like fun. Like we take this delight in trying to understand God's work in the world. So in the scriptures, one of the phrases they use to talk about God's work in the world is they call a marvelous work and a wonder. And so, like, I think of something that's a marvelous work and a wonder is something where you just sort of stand back and go, wow, that's really cool, right? Like the Grand Canyon is a marvelous work and a wonder. And so maybe part of what theology is like we're just trying to get our heads around the sort of majesty of God's work in the world. And that can actually be something that brings us joy and happiness if you're the sort of person who reads B.H. Roberts for joy and happiness. But all of that to me seems secondary to God's work in the world. So the thing that's real, the thing that is the solid bedrock, is God working in the world. And theology, that's just a theory we have about God working in the world. The way we talk about how God works in the world changes. It might change
Yes.
because God is working in the world. It might change because we have differing things that we emphasize. It might change because we learn some other thing that now informs the way we think about God's working in the world. But the fact that theology changes, right, just means that like our understanding of God's working in the world has changed. But the
Yeah.
important thing about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is not it has the perfect theology that gives us the answer to everything in the world. right? The important thing about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is doing God's work in the world. And it has a necessary and vital role that God has given to it in his work in the world. And it's trying to do that work. And theology, that's one of the tools that we use in doing the work.
Yeah.
But the primary purpose is to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of God's children.
Yeah.
It's not to make sure that you're never mistaken about your theory of
Atonement.
theology.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. To me, this just really turns down the temperature on this whole sealing conversation because I think what's so hard about getting familiar with our history with sealings is that if you're trying to integrate every iteration of what this ordinance meant to us as a people from the very beginning, you're doing some kind of gymnastics to keep it all together. And this just feels like a kind of openness that will both help us to claim what feels like God's work in the world, like just completely own and lean into what feels like God alive and working in our lives, and just let the things that are not working that felt like they needed to change and did change, we can let those flow right back out. And so I really appreciate that. I think that's such a helpful differentiation. And I think that really sets us up. I know you've talked about three strata or three different eras of our understanding of the purpose of sealing. So maybe just to frame our entire relationship with sealing, could you just walk us through the three strata?
Let me preface this by saying that what I'm doing is imposing simplicity on something that's not simple,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And I do think there's sort of three eras or differing big approaches to sealing. But I want to be clear, right? These are categories that I'm imposing because I'm trying to make
Okay.
sense of what I see and read and have learned about the past. And I want to be clear that transitions from one era to another, they're never clean. There's always precursors of the later eras and the earlier periods. And there are elements of the earlier theologies that survive into the later eras. And things are oftentimes not as clean as I would present them.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the church has changed in this very important sense. We think today of the church as being a fairly integrated institution that has official positions and procedures that are
Yeah.
like articulated by people in Salt Lake City that articulate the official church position and procedure. That's not how the church has really run for much of its period. So oftentimes there wasn't that single rule about how sealing
Really?
rules in the Manti Temple would be different than sealing rules in the St. George Temple, because nobody had ever actually sat down and said, well, there should be one, like the official church thing. So,
Wow.
with all of that
Okay.
throat clearing, like the world is really messy. And so
Okay.
to try and make that messiness a little bit more tractable, here's what I would say
Okay.
is the earliest notion of sealing centers on the idea that salvation consists of becoming part of an exalted kingdom of exalted beings, and that part of what it means to become exalted is to be exalted in a sort of kingdom of priesthood. What exactly that means is left pretty vague.
Okay.
Okay. But you have to be connected in some way to some kind of a priesthood kingdom. And the way you get connected into a priesthood kingdom is through a sealing ordinance. It's not the only way, but one of the ways that you do is that the sealing ordinance creates a connection that is a sort of eternal and exalting connection of some kind. And then those connections sort of build networks that take us back ultimately to be sealed into God's kingdom and to receive his exaltation. So the earliest concern with sealing is about being sealed into an exalting kingdom. And there are two ways that this shows up that to modern Latter-day Saints just seems really weird. So
Okay.
the first way that it shows up is in polygamy and plural sealings. So we think of plural sealings in part because people talk this way, like it's not bad or wrong to say this, but this is what we focus on is we think about sealings in terms of families, and then we think about families as at the center of that is an eternal union between a man and a woman in a marriage. And then we think about plural sealings is like there were plural families. And so
Mhm.
there it's like sort of eternal families on steroids, right? Is one way
Okay.
of sort of thinking about it. Definitely, like you totally find 19th century Latter-day Saint polygamists talking that way about the theology of polygamy. But one of the things that was happening in plural sealings is that the plural sealings were a way of creating connections between people. So one of the weird things about plural sealings is like what counts as a marriage and what counts as a sealing doesn't completely overlap. So you have women who are sealed to men who don't really have any kind of social relationship to those men. You have women who are sealed to men while being married to another man, and they continue to be married to that other man, even though they've been sealed. So, what those sealings are doing is they're like creating these connections in which people are sort of plugging themselves into a spiritual kingdom. And in Joseph Smith's day, the only kind of sealing that Joseph Smith conceptualized or had an idea of was a marriage sealing. Like that was
Mm.
the only, if you think about like he has a kind of toolbox of ordinances, the only ordinance that he has is this idea of marriage sealings, and then everybody has to be sealed together. So all connections have to occur through marriage sealings. So, like for example,
Mm.
Heber C. Kimball wants to have a sealing connection with Joseph Smith. There is only one kind of sealing that exists, and that kind of sealing is a marriage sealing. So Heber C. Kimball asks Joseph Smith to be sealed to his teenage daughter, right? It's one of Joseph Smith's youngest plural wives. That sealing was created because Heber C. Kimball wanted a connection with Joseph Smith that was a sealing connection, and the plural sealing was a way of doing that.
Mm.
So one thing that's happening in plural marriage is just stuff that's not marriage that we think of as being marriage. It's about people getting these sort of sealing connections into some sort of exalting kingdom. And the exalting kingdoms
Interesting.
are centered around people that we think are like very, very righteous and are going to be sealed back to God.
So
Um,
leaders of the church
yeah,
essentially at that
usually
time.
usually leaders of the church, but you also have like there's all sorts of strange sealing practices. And then some of those sealings are also marriages, right? They're all sort of marriage sealings, but in addition to being marriage sealings, some of them actually operate as like social marriages in the world. So they form households, they have children, there's economic interdependence, there's sexual relationships, the things that we associate with marriage. Some of that accompanies sealings, but sometimes it doesn't. And the reason sometimes it doesn't is because sealing is not just like eternal marriage. Sealing is connection into eternal kingdom. The second
Okay.
way that kingdom theology shows up is something called the law of adoption. So the law of adoption is actually not instituted by Joseph Smith. It's instituted by Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles shortly after Joseph Smith's martyrdom. They think that they're carrying forward Joseph Smith's teachings. It may be that this is Brigham Young working out what he sees as the implications of the doctrines and things that he learned from Joseph Smith. Maybe Joseph Smith taught this to him and he's just doing what Joseph Smith taught him. I don't know the answer to that question. But in the law of adoption, what happens is adults are sealed in non-conjugal sealings to other adults. So men are sealed to other men. Women might be with their husbands sealed to another man as an adoptive sealing. So those are sealings. They're not understood as conjugal, so they're not like marriage sealings. I would not claim, and I think it would be wrong to claim that these are
Mm.
like same-sex marriage sealings or something like that, even though they are adult male to adult male sealings of people who are not related by blood. But the idea was by being spiritually adopted into someone's sort of family, I become part of their expanded, exalting kingdom. And everybody needs to be involved in some kind of exalting kingdom. We need to have tools that allow us to be sealed into those exalting kingdoms. And the law of adoption, which are these adult adoptive sealings, is a way of doing that.
So would this be an adult being sealed as a son or daughter or
Yes.
sibling or okay.
They would be sealed as a son or daughter,
Okay.
right? So someone would be sealed as a spiritual son, whatever that might mean, to Heber C. Kimball or to Brigham Young or to Wilford Woodruff. There was this sense, at least for a little while, that then there also might be like social implications for that in the real world, and that there might be sort of like quasi-fraternal
Mhm.
relationships between those people. So, for example, the social organization of pioneer companies might mirror the adoptive sealing rituals. Adoptive
Oh.
adoptive sealings are a little bit odd in that, as I understand it, they're performed in the Nauvoo temple, And then when the saints lose the Nauvoo temple, they are not performed. There are no adoptive sealings again
Really?
until the St. George temple is dedicated in 1877. So the law of adoption for 30 years, it sort of exists as a practice because there are these people who had had sealed relationships. It exists as a sort of a theological teaching that people have. There are people that want to have adoptive sealings performed. And as I understand, there's like kind of like a wait list. And then
Really?
the St. George Temple opens, and then the law of adoption starts again in 1877. So the law of adoption is discontinued in 1894 by Wilford Woodruff. And one way of thinking about this is Wilford Woodruff is the president of the St. George Temple. That's the first temple that's dedicated by the saints in Utah. And Wilford Woodruff kind of has to figure out, like, what do you do with the temple? They hadn't had one for 30
Yeah.
years. They had endowment houses. So there were things that we're doing, but he's in charge of the temple. So he's spending a lot of time in doing temple work, thinking about temple work. And in the 1890s, Wilford Woodruff, in some ways, sort of remakes the temple and particularly remakes sealing ordinances. And he does that
Wow.
in two ways. So the first is he issues the manifesto, which sort of starts a complicated and messy process of ending plural marriage. The other thing in 1894 that he says is we're going to end the law of adoption. So we're still going to have sealings in which adults are sealed in adoptive sealings to other people. But these adoptive sealings are now going to happen along family lines. So before 1894, you would do adoptive sealings, and oftentimes you would do adoptive sealings if people were Latter-day Saints. So, like, I might be sealed to my father if my father died before we could go to the temple, but he was a Latter-day Saint, so I'd be sealed to my father. But then my father might be sealed to Brigham Young posthumously. Or,
Wow.
like,
Okay.
all of my ancestors might be sealed to me in adoptive sealings, and then I would be sealed to Brigham Young.
If
So
they were not Latter-day Saints,
if they were
are they
not Latter-day Saints. The other
excluded?
thing, again, right, it's dangerous to think like there's a manual that explains
Right.
all,
Okay. Right.
right? Because
Yeah.
there isn't. It's just like a practice that's happening. So what Wilford Woodruff is, according to the sermon that he gives in 1894, he's never really completely comfortable with the law of adoption. So he'd sort of been in a stupor of thought about the law of adoption. He says he'd been in a stupor of thought about the law of adoption like all the way back in Nauvoo. He was sort of uncomfortable with it. So I sort of have this vision of Wilford sort of being uncomfortable with this for a long, 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 long time. And then he says, I received a revelation in 1894. And what the revelation says is we're going to continue to do adoptive sealings. We're going to do them along family lines. So you are going to be sealed to your grandfather, and then your grandfather is going to be sealed to his father, and his father, and his father, and father and mother, all the way back, and all the way back to Adam, if we can do it, is what
Wow.
Wilford Woodruff says. Before 1894, nobody did those sealings. People did
No.
not seal their ancestors. So they talked a lot about redeeming the dead. And today, when we talk about redeeming the dead, we understand that as temple work, and we understand that temple work involves baptisms for the dead, it involves proxy endowment ordinances, and it involves proxy sealing ordinances. But when they were talking about work for the dead and saying, like, seek out your ancestors and seek out your kindred dead, what they meant was find people and do baptisms for the dead, but don't do sealings because sealings is governed by the law of adoption. And so there weren't like those
Wow.
family sealings. So in
Yeah.
1894, we now get a different vision of what sealings is about. Sealings is about sort of replicating the human family in the eternities. But the important part, the thing that's new, that's being emphasized by Wilford Woodruff is these long chains of ancestors are going to be connected in sealing lines. And there's still sort of echoes of the old kingdom theology because we continue to think that sealing ordinances are necessary for salvation. And if we're going all the way back to Adam, in a sense, we're all
Mm.
being sealed into the great patriarchal priesthood kingdom of Adam. So there's still those echoes of
Yeah.
that older kingdom theology. But the old adoptive sealings, we're getting rid of those, and everything is about lineage and family line. So I think this is sort of a second kind of theology of
Yeah.
sealing, where we're now more focused on families. And we're more focused on this idea that we're trying to perpetuate earthly family structures in some sense into the eternities through the sealing ordinances. That had been done before, but it wasn't the central thing that like the law of adoption is doing.
Yeah.
So we get that notion, and then that's when we get like a huge emphasis on genealogy work. That's when what becomes the Genealogical Society of Utah is founded. And there's starts being like a systematic effort by the church to bring in genealogical records so that people can trace back these lines of lineage so they can perform all of the ordinances and seal those ancestral lines in the temple. And that way of thinking about temple work, that's Wilford Woodruff's way of thinking about temple work. Joseph Smith
Wow.
did not think about temple work that way. Brigham Young did not think about temple work that way. Wilford Woodruff thinks about temple work that way. And Wilford Woodruff, when he announced that we were going to do this, it was sufficiently new that Wilford Woodruff said in General Conference, I have received a revelation that this is what we are supposed to do.
Really?
So I think about President Nelson when he rededicated the Washington, D.C. temple. He gave a sermon in the temple dedication, and he said, the Lord hasn't finished revealing all of the temple ordinances to us. He hasn't finished revealing everything about the temple to us. So that's an ongoing process of revelation. And I think you see that in the way in which the way we think about temple ordinances starts shifting at the end of the 19th century. And if you had to pick a date, I'd pick 1894. And that's when they get rid of the law of adoption.
And can I ask you about that? Because that's fascinating. It seems like in most cases we sort of just layer on more meaning. And
Mhm.
but law of adoption was so interesting because it's like an explicit change in direction. So what happened to all of those sealings that had already been performed? Were they resealed to people
So
in their own lines?
that's a great question because this revelation comes down in 1894, and people have been doing temple work for their ancestors, starting with the St. George Temple in 1877. Also important to understand is that, as I understand it, there are no proxy temple ordinances before 1877. So there are endowment
Really?
ordinances, there are sealings in the endowment houses, but they're only for living people. There aren't proxy ordinances. Proxy ordinances have to be done in the temple. So there had been all this proxy
Okay.
work that had been done under the sort of law of adoption understanding. And so lots of people had done like a lot of genealogy and they had all these ancestors going back to the Mayflower. And all of these people had been adopted in adoptive sealings to Joseph Smith or to Heber
Okay.
Septimore or someone. So then what happens is people write letters to Wilford Woodruff and they say, I'd really like to be sealed to grandpa. Can I be sealed to grandpa instead of being sealed to Brigham Young? So what do we do with that?
Yeah.
And Wilford Woodruff comes up with a sort of policy. Again, that's a little anachronistic, but this is what he does. He says, if anybody asks, we will cancel the previous sealing and we will note the cancellation of the previous sealings in the records of the temple, and they can be sealed along family lines. If they don't request it, we leave the sealing in place. We don't do anything. The other thing that comes out is this idea of cancellation of sealings. So we have this notion, right, that the president of the church has the keys to cancel the sealing ordinances, and that sort of wipes the sealing out, and then you could do other new kinds of sealings. Nobody, as near as I can tell, before Wilford Woodruff thought that you could do that. Brigham Young did
Really?
not think, as near as I can tell, did not think that he could cancel sealings.
So
And he
even in the
did,
case of divorce, because I know Brigham Young, we've talked about how he, like, there were a lot of divorces happening in
yes,
Brigham Young's
yes.
time that didn't necessarily come with a, or there wasn't even an understanding, you're saying, of a need
So,
to cancel a
yeah,
sealing.
so as I understand it, Brigham Young did not think that he had the authority to cancel sealings. They were
Wow.
doing divorces. There were what was called a church divorce, where people would come to the president of the church and they say, we want to get a divorce. And then the president of the church would say, yeah, you can get divorced. And Brigham was pretty liberal about granting divorces, especially to women. He was harder on men. So he would give all these sermons that would be like, never get divorced. And if you're complaining about your husband or your wife, you're a bad person and don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. So he's like, his bark and growl is really fierce and ferocious. But then, like, when you ask him to actually do something, he's like, yeah, you don't have to stay married to that loser.
Wow.
And so they'd grant the divorce. But the church divorce was just thought as a divorce, and it would do things like set out alimony or child support obligations, all those things that a secular divorce does. And in a world where you have lots of plural marriages and the plural marriages, you can't litigate those in front of the secular court system, the internal church process becomes really important because it's
Yeah.
basically substituting for what the legal system would do. So then in the 1890s, they developed this idea that maybe those church divorces are also maybe canceling sealings. But the
Okay.
earliest cases I found where the president of the church explicitly says cancel that sealing is Wilford Woodruff, and he's saying we're canceling law of adoption sealings. So I think what Brigham Young would have thought is that, roughly speaking, couples can dissolve ceilings themselves.
Oh,
Right. So when
interesting.
couples decide that they no longer can live in peace and harmony, that is a sort of withdrawing of the spirit of something from their marriage, and that their enmity towards one another would dissolve the ceiling. And so he would say, like, I can't dissolve it, but you guys can dissolve it through your own
Oh,
behavior.
okay.
He's a little bit ambiguous. I mean,
Interesting.
he's sort of speaking off the cuff, and he's saying things like, it takes a power higher than mine to dissolve a ceiling between a good man and a good woman. But if you are unrighteous with one another, the ceiling's not going to do you any good anyways. But
Okay.
people are getting divorced. He's not canceling ceilings. And then
Yeah.
people can get remarried and they can get resealed, men and women.
Okay.
So there are women in the 19th century who they get married, they get sealed, the marriage fails, they get divorced, and then they get remarried, and then they get sealed a second time. And the first sealing, the first pregnancy doesn't do anything to the first sealing.
Wow. Okay. So then we kind of I think this was the most interesting thing to me. Like I definitely project this assumption that the nuclear family has always been at the heart of who we are as a people. And it's so fascinating to imagine that to Joseph Smith, it sounds like it really wasn't about the nuclear family. It wasn't families can be together forever in this era of our church. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
It's complicated. So, in a very simple way, you could say, yes, Joseph Smith's primary way of thinking about what sealing ordinances were doing was not to bind up nuclear families and sort of replicate them into the eternities. He thought that what we're doing is we're being sealed up to eternal life or something like
Yeah.
that. If you go through Joseph Smith's writings and sermons, this phrase, sealed up to eternal life, he uses that a lot.
Yeah.
That said, he totally has this idea that ceilings unite couples in the eternities and
Okay.
that you want to be united to the man or woman that you love and is your spouse in the eternities. There's a great passage from Parley P. Pratt where he talks about the revelation of the sealing ordinances, and he talks all about it in terms of companionate marriage and how marvelous it is that he can be married for eternity to his wife that
Hmm.
he loves. So it's not that that language isn't present. It's not that people aren't thinking that. It's just that there's a danger when you look into the past that we look at all of the things that seem familiar to us and we say, oh, well, they're doing what we were doing.
Yeah.
And then we sort of ignore the stuff that's not familiar to us. So you can sort of do a cherry pick. You can cherry pick things that people say and things that they do. And there's definitely like continuity and a through line there, and those ideas are present. But there are all these other ideas that are present that are really, 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 really important. And so I don't want to say that they didn't think at all about eternal families, but you can't just look at the things that they're saying in the past that are familiar to us and ignore all the
Yeah.
other stuff.
Yeah.
And when they talk about families, especially for Wilford Woodruff, what they're mostly talking about is extended families of like chains of ancestors, is what they mean
Really.
by families. And maybe they're also talking about like the eternity of the marriage relationship. But the focus on like families can be together forever. Nobody is singing that song in primary in 1905. So that idea of families and the strong association that the temple has with the nuclear family, and the temple is the way that you're going to be with your family forever. If I had to sort of pick the prophet who articulates that, it's David O. McKay.
Really?
So what
That's
you
really recent. That's not that
yeah,
long
so
ago.
like, and again, like you can overstate the discontinuities here,
Right. Yeah.
right? So like, I'm sure you can find Heber J. Grant talking about being married for eternity or something like that. But the church after 1945, one way of thinking about this is the church trying to figure out like what's a good missionary message that we can
Mhm.
give to the world. So like in the 19th century, the missionary message that like Brigham Young and Parley P. Pratt took to Great Britain was the heavens are open and the spiritual gifts are real. And we have the gifts of the Spirit here, just like we did in the New Testament. That's a really compelling message, and lots of people joined the
Wow.
church for that message. In America, which is actually pretty unique in the world at the time, there's enormous amounts of sectarian conflict, and there's lots of sectarian choice. So there's lots of different kinds of different religious choices. That's not true in like Italy in the 1840s, but it's true in the United States. So then there's this message of like, this is the one true church. Like, which church are you supposed to join?
Okay.
Story that Joseph tells about the first vision. Which church are you supposed to join? That's a really compelling message. So then the question is, after 1945, in the second half of the 20th century, what's the really compelling message? And we keep saying all those messages. You can find lots of people talking about those in the 1950s, 1960s, and people talking about them today. But the message that's really, really compelling is religion will help you have a happy and stable family. And our religion, the religion of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is going to help you have a happy and stable family. And in fact, that family is at the center of our most holy rituals in the temple. And the temple is the place that we go in order to have families that are together forever. And the way that family gets inflected in there is primarily the nuclear family. It's about, I am going to be with my spouse and I'm going to be with my children forever. And that message resonates. It's really, really, really powerful with people. It is clearly central to missionary work, but it's also central to what the church is doing. So the church is starting to build temples. And one of the really amazing things to me about David O. McKay is they are building temples in Europe and New Zealand, and there are no stakes in Europe when they build those
Really?
temples. It's like we're going to build it, and then we will build the church around the temple. Like the temple will anchor the church. And the
And
other
it
thing that
did. I
anchors
mean,
the church, it did.
yeah.
It was wild. I mean, I'm a very cautious and pessimistic person. And if you'd come to me in 1950 and said, President McKay said, should we build a temple in Switzerland? I would have said, like, there are no members in Switzerland. Why would we do that? Right? And there were people at the time who were a little concerned. But President McKay's vision was if we build these temples and we center the church around the message of eternal families and the way in which the temple can facilitate eternal families, then that will be the basis for growth for the church. And he was right, right? The church expands massively after World War II, and especially in the 1960s and then into the 70s, it really expands rapidly. And the central message, it's not the only message, but a central message is about eternal nuclear families and the way that the temple and the sealing ordinances facilitate them. But notice the message isn't like, how is your great, 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 great grandfather going to be saved?
Yeah.
Right? Nobody's handing out pamphlets
Yeah.
like, are you concerned about your connection with your great, 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 great aunt? We have ordinances in the temple that will ensure that connection, right? Whereas for Wilford Woodruff, like that was important. Like I want to be connected back to all of my ancestors.
Wow.
But that's not really the message that we have after
Yeah.
World War II. So the story that we have that really centers the nuclear family with the temple, I think, is largely a product of David O. McKay. The other thing that's important to understand is that before David O. McKay, people did not go to the temple very often. So this
Really.
idea
So it
that
wasn't like
like,
a regular
no,
worship
no, you
experience.
might go to the temple once in your life. If you go to the temple, it would take a very long time because the endowment ceremony was really long.
So you're saying even if you lived near a temple, because I'm sure people are like, well, yeah, there were no, where would you go? But you're saying even if you live next door to
Yeah,
the temple,
even if you live close to the temple, you're not going to the temple a lot.
interesting.
There are people who are, right? So there are people that are like kind of temple people or temple workers, but that's kind of seen as like a sort of niche thing. To the point, for example, that when Heber J. Grant was doing temple work for all of his ancestors, so he was following the counsel from the prophet from President Woodruff, and he had gotten all of this information about his ancestors, and he wanted to do temple work for all of them. He didn't have time to do it, and there weren't like lots of patrons that were going to the temple to do it, so he paid people to do it.
Really? Wow.
And that was actually pretty common because it would take a lot of time. And so there are people in the church, and you pay these people sort of their modest expense to do temple work because most people didn't do temple work. There's this very telling moment during the Smoot hearings when Reed Smoot, who's been elected to the Senate from Utah, and he's also an apostle, and there's this big scandal about things that are happening in Utah and whether or not we can seat this Mormon apostle in the United States Senate. And he's cross-examined before the Senate Privileges and Elections Committee. And anti-Mormons were making hay about the temple. Temple's filled with all these secret oaths to overthrow the government, et cetera, et cetera, like lots of suspicion around the temple. And they ask him, Smoot, about the temple. And the answer that Smoot gives is he says, I've only been once. And it was a long time ago, just before I went on my mission. I haven't been back since. Well, so like he might have
Wow.
been like he might be being coy or dissembling or just lying to avoid controversy in that. But it's not implausible. It's not
Wow.
implausible that he was not going to do, endowment sessions on the weekend. So one thing that happens when President McKay starts building these temples is that we develop this idea that temple worship is part of what you do as a Latter-day Saint. Like you go and regularly worship in the temple. And the reason that you're going and regularly worshiping in the temple is part of sort of centering that message of eternal families. And the temple is sort of at the center of that message of eternal families. And I think that the making that the central framing of it, I think that's really
Yeah.
since the 1950s.
Wow, that is so interesting. And I can see how taking that assumed centrality and then looking at our past, that sort of amplifies the pain, I think, of these polygamous unions. But I think if I'm like going for the jugular in the Richard Bushman way, I think that what I'd love to hear you talk about is that to me, it feels like in a lot of ways and throughout a lot of these decades, women seem to be the pawns in all of these iterations of sealings, or at least in for sure in the first. And it seems like, when you were telling the story about Helen Mar Kimball, like honestly, that almost feels like a relief. Like that's a better version, I think, of the story than Joseph Smith chose a 14-year-old.
Mhm.
That is abhorrent in my heart, you know.
Sure,
And
sure.
I would prefer to think that this was a conversation between her dad, I guess, and Joseph, and they wanted to have a connection. But like even then, like that still feels abhorrent. She was
Yeah.
this pawn in that conversation. And there's another thing that you write somewhere about that President Benson was sealed to his first cousin who was deceased, and his wife was her proxy. And I think that was just one random example of another way that it seems like there was still, even in the 50s, this feeling that women somehow were contributing to this, to a man's kingdom, like to his family kingdom. And it just feels like there's so little autonomy. It feels so misaligned with our genuine belief in partnership. So I'd love to hear how you metabolize that. I think this is probably one of these ways, exactly, that you brought up in the beginning, where our understanding of God's work in the world is evolving as we grow and evolve and culture matures and evolves too. But that's what's excruciating about this to me, that like the women seem like objects in the story.
I
Yeah.
I think those are completely valid concerns, right? Like I'm not a woman, so I'm sure my sort of emotional experience of this is different. But that said, the fact that I think, I think the proper understanding of the Helen Mar Kimball story is I don't think Joseph Smith is a child predator. But I do think the story is that Helen Mar Kimball is being used as a sort of liturgical tool to create connections between men. And that is in its own way troubling, right? It's troubling in a way that doesn't fit neatly into a script about child predators or something, but because of the way it instrumentalizes women in that relationship. I
Yeah.
think clearly, right, there is a really strong patriarchal through line through
Mm,
the kingdom theology and the lineage theology, right? In among
yeah.
other things, because when Wilford Woodruff is saying we need to be sealed along ancestral lines, the ancestral lines that he has in mind, and he talks about are patrilineal lines, not matrilineal lines. Although
Oh, really?
there end up being matrilineal sealings as well, right? Because women will be sealed to their parents. So yes, I think that that is all true. And women who find that troubling, I don't think are mistaken or wrong or anything like that. I think it's genuinely troubling. So then I guess my pastoral question is do I have anything that would be useful to say
Yeah.
other than, yeah. And I don't know. I'm always told it's bad to try to be pastoral to women because I don't have that experience. And so I will say the wrong and dismissive things. So my inclination is to say nothing at all. But if you ask me, here's what I would say is that one of the things that Eternal Families is doing is that Eternal Families is actually making the temple less patriarchal. And I don't want to deny that there continue to be patriarchal elements in our temple practices, in part because, again, these sort of three stages I talk about, nothing
Yeah.
is ever completely gone, right? Everything is always sort of hanging around on our bits and pieces of ritual and discourse and understanding.
Interesting. Yeah.
But the nuclear family is a much less patriarchal model than, say, using polygamous marriage sealings to create connections between men, right?
Yeah.
Because
Wow.
the idea is that the central important saving dyad is this dyad between men and women,
Yeah.
right? And the man needs the woman, and the woman needs the man in the dyad. Now, we can define that dyad in patriarchal terms, right? Like with the presiding male and the subordinate female. And certainly there's a ton of Latter-day Saint discourse about that. Over time, that discourse, I think, is being eroded away, right?
Mhm.
So if you look into recent discussions, there's all this language about presiding, and then what people you say, well, what does it mean? And the one thing that we know is that like it's not supposed to be a rejection of an equal partnership. So to me, what that
Yeah.
looks like is a theology that is dissipating over time. And
Mm.
I might wish that it would dissipate faster. But what I see is a process of those ordinances becoming more egalitarian and
Yeah.
less overtly patriarchal. So
Yes.
that's one
Yeah.
thing that I would say. The other thing that I would say is that I think that the sealing ordinances are God doing his work in the world. And what I see when I look at all of those practices is I see the authorities of the church struggling to know how it is that we're supposed to use this sealing power that we've been given.
Mm.
So they know that they have, because like there was an angel that came in the Kirtland Temple, gave these keys to the authorities of the church, and they're trying to understand how they should use those keys. And I think about Wilford Woodruff's talking about the law of adoption. And he says, I was always troubled by this because it seemed like people were kind of politicking to figure out who
Wow.
would be the best person to get adopted to. And he said, I wasn't comfortable with that. So
Yeah.
what that tells me is that part of the history of the sealing ordinances from the beginning has been people saying, let's try to figure out how we're supposed to use this authority. And
Yeah.
maybe we're using that authority in ways that are troubling. Wolford Woodruff thought that the way that Brigham Young had been using it was troubling.
Wow.
And he went to the Lord and got a revelation on that. Now,
Yes.
that doesn't mean that everything is fine now, that there aren't continuing to be things that are troubling to people. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be troubled about things that are happening in the past. But I think that it is possible for things to change over time. And so then I think you just have to fall back on the idea of hope,
Yeah.
right? That part of what it means to live amidst a kind of messy and not completely perfectly achieved system is that you're going to hope that things get worked out and
Yeah.
become better in the future.
Yeah.
And it would be nice if that happened faster and it happened in ways that like if I had some notion of like what the perfect outcome would be, but like I'm not sure I actually know what the perfect outcome would be, and there's some value in things not always moving super fast. But like I that's all I can say
Yeah.
to someone who is troubled in those ways. But you're not the only person who's ever been troubled by this. Wilford Woodruff,
Yeah.
why?
Yeah. Right. And
I
that
mean,
that
Wilford, he wasn't, to be clear, right? I don't want to make Wilford Woodruff out as like proto-feminist or something like that.
no,
Like Wilford Woodruff's,
yeah.
the reason he was troubled were not gendered, right?
Right.
But he saw other aspects of the practice that he thought were troubling, and he clearly went to
Right.
the Lord, and the Lord gave him a revelation that says, "No, we should do something differently." And
Yes. Right. And I
President
love
President
that.
Nelson said that we're going
Yeah.
to keep getting revelations on the temple. I'm sorry,
Yeah. Well, just that being troubled preceded the revelation. Like that was part of the process. I know I have to let you go soon, but I would really love for you to address one more question sort of in this realm. And that's this, it's the asymmetry, because I think this is one of the ripples of these earlier iterations of our understanding of ceilings. And what we have now are these very asymmetrical policies where a woman can't be sealed to multiple husbands. And I know there are some complicated caveats and there have been exceptions, but my understanding of the policy now is that if you lost a husband, if you were sealed, there's this assumption that you'll have to choose between which sealing will be canceled or honored or what, like you won't be also sealed to another husband. And what is especially painful to me about that is that it's totally asymmetrical and that a man is not having that wrestle and could just be sealed again to another spouse if they lost a spouse. And that's so alive in our community still. And I think it's one of these places where instead of being this generous doctrine that is comforting and that like all the things that I feel like the spirit of sealing is meant to be, it can be a place that it has a razor sharp edge, like just really causes a lot of pain. So I think it helps me to understand a little bit of the background, like how these policies came to be, because I think otherwise I assume that it carries the same weight as the ordinance itself, that like these policies that maybe evolve, they feel just as concrete as the theology itself. So it helps me to understand the context in which the policies were created. And I thought that this was especially fascinating. Like, who decided that this would be the policy about women who are widows, who are remarried, and what that means for their sealed family?
So there are, I think, actually sort of two questions here.
Okay.
One question is about the policies in the church now with regard to sealing. So, like, if you want to go to the temple and be sealed, what do you have to do in order to go to the temple and be sealed? So, there's the question about policy. Then there's a sort of theological question about, okay, like, how does all this get worked out in the eternities and what is the meaning
Yeah.
of that? So, let me speak to the first part and then
Okay.
the second part. In terms of the symmetry, before the 1890s, there was no cancellation of sealings. So if a woman was sealed to a man and then her husband died, she could get remarried and she could be resealed. She could be resealed to the second man. If she was married to a man and they were divorced and they had been sealed, she could be sealed to a second man, but the previous sealing wouldn't have been canceled by the first presidency because the first
Okay.
presidency just didn't cancel any sealings. It wasn't something that was sort of in their ritual toolbox. So then in the 1890s, as near as I can tell, it's hard because getting access to sources about temple ceilings and stuff, this is confidential
Yeah.
and difficult. And I live in Virginia and they're better historians than me. So, like, subject to the caveat, I may have like the chronology a little bit off. But basically, as I understand, is in the 1890s, they start granting cancellation of sealings. And initially, that's about the law of adoption. It's about canceling the law of adoption sealing so that there can now be new sealings along family lines. There are cases where people are petitioning and saying, I would like to cancel a sealing that was a marriage sealing. And the cancellation of marriage sealings is actually, it's sort of an extraordinary remedy. It doesn't happen very often. It's usually dealing with cases of abuse. So
Mm.
there is a woman who had been abused by a spouse that may be dead or she's divorced from, and she wants that sealing canceled. Or sometimes it's mom and dad are now both dead, but dad was a real bastard to mom, and we'd like to get that sealing canceled first
Wow.
presidency. And there's
Wow.
not really a policy about it. It's not like they always treat these things one way or the other. Now,
Okay.
the diaries that I've read from members of the first presidency that discuss this, the overwhelming thing I get is just like caution, right? They don't have a clear policy about it. They're just very, very cautious about it. So then what happens is there is an apostle named George Richards, who's the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in the 1930s. And he
Hmm.
is made president of the Salt Lake Temple. And the president of the Salt Lake Temple was the de facto head of the temple department. So the president of the Salt Lake Temple is like in charge of temple stuff
Okay.
everywhere. And people are asking all these questions like, there's a woman and she's been divorced and she was sealed to this previous husband. Could she be sealed to someone else? And before, like, you just go to the temple president, and the temple president would just give his answer. And if you didn't like his answer, maybe you could write the first presidency, but it's not like there was a policy. And the
Okay.
policy in the Logan Temple could be different than the policy in the Manti Temple. And so George Richards is going to make everything consistent. And so they come up with a rule. And the rule they come up with is the asymmetrical rule. So, in order for a woman to be sealed a second time, her previous sealing must be canceled. But a man does not have to get the previous sealing canceled. So that just looks a lot like polygamy in the eternities. One thing that's important to understand is that's not how, when they were practicing polygamy, the sealing rules work. So it's not like, not Brigham
Oh,
Young's sealing rules,
yeah.
a different set of
Interesting.
sealing rules. And like, I don't know exactly why they adopted that rule. I've got a theory about it, and that is that those were people, the highest leadership of the church, especially in the first presidency, they believed in polygamy. Heber J. Grant believed that polygamy was an eternal principle because Heber J. Grant was a polygamist. And he'd like been on the underground. He'd been persecuted by the federal government because of polygamy. And so polygamy wasn't being practiced anymore, but absolutely Heber J. Grant believed in polygamy in the eternities. And Heber J. Grant is actually in this odd position where he is actually fighting tooth and nail to kick polygamists out of the church. He's a polygamist who's like on the prowl to try and kick out other polygamists. And I think it has to have been the case that like there must have been cognitive dissonance that he's suffering from that. And one of the things that the temple rules do is you can sort of say, yeah, I have cognitive dissonance in the here and now, but I don't have it in the eternities. So
Wow.
I kind of
Yeah.
suspect that in some ways that those asymmetric rules were rules that were put in place by people who were really uncomfortable with the policies of the church, including the first presidency. And the policy of the church is we hate polygamy, we are militantly monogamous. But the president of the church had been a polygamist. Many people in the Quorum of the 12 had been polygamists. And so for them, the aggressive monogamy of the church is what is troubling,
Yeah.
right? And the rules about the ordinances that come into place in the 1930s, which is the woman has to get a cancellation of the sealing in order to be married, is like them coping with that. Now, those are male concerns that are being foregrounded and dealt with, and female concerns are not, right? So it's a patriarchal and sexist response in that sense. But it is, I think, something, this is my personal theory. I think
Yeah.
it's sort of struggling with that dissonance. So then that rule is the rule that we basically have for living couples now.
Yeah.
But that also at the time was the rule for family history work as well. So for proxy rules,
Wow.
a woman could only be sealed to one man. And so then you think, well, what about if she'd been married to three different men? Who does she get sealed to? And the answer initially the rules gave is she should be sealed to the person that she would have wanted to have been sealed in during life, right? Which that question might make sense if your ancestor is a Latter-day Saint who never got to the temple. But if your ancestor was like living in Germany in the 1520s, that's not a question you can really answer.
Yeah.
So then the answer was you just seal them to the first person. Okay.
Wow.
So we're trying to have the same rules for dead people and for living people. So
Yeah.
then David O. McKay blows that system up. And the reason that that system gets blown up by David O. McKay is because we're now going to have temple worship. We have all these temples. We want people to go to the temples regularly. And if they're going to go to the temples regularly, there has to be ordinances for them to do when they go to the temple, which means there has to be names of people that they can perform in the temple. And they don't have enough names to keep the temple going. So then they say, we will extract names from genealogical records through the name extraction program, and we will seal all of those people that we've extracted from the name extraction program. At which point, you look at those records, you don't know. If I have a parish record that says, Lucy was married to this person, I don't know if Lucy had another husband,
Yeah.
right? Because she might have been married in another parish and then her husband died, or like after the mid-19th century, so they might have been divorced or something. So you just don't know. And so it goes up
Yeah.
to President McKay and they say, can we seal these people together? And President McKay says, yes, you can seal them together, even though we know that this will result in women with multiple sealings. The women will be sealed to multiple men in the eternities posthumously. And that had actually been the rule before the 1930s.
But is there still this implication that the woman will then choose?
So that's then the theological question. So when we
Okay.
have multiple sealings, let me just say one thing about the practice. The
Yeah.
practice has always been subject to exceptions. The first
Okay.
presidency since the 1930s has often granted permission for living women to be sealed a second time without the cancellation of the first sealing. This arose repeatedly after World War II and after Vietnam, where there were women. They were sealed to young men, and then the young men went off to war and died. And then the woman wants to be remarried, but
Yeah.
she doesn't want to cancel the sealing that she had with her husband who died young. And they go to the first prince and say, can we get sealed a second time? And David O. McKay would always say yes.
Really?
So then the theological question, the answer the church gives now is we don't know what will happen. What Brigham Young would have thought was that people get to choose in the eternities if they're women. Men, maybe the men will be polygamists in the eternities, but Brigham Young didn't think that was per se going to be the case because he thought the man whose wife is sealed to multiple women, like that sealing may be invalid in the eternities if the man's been a bad guy or the woman's been a bad guy. So there's this notion of like you choose. And I will say the problem with the notion of choose is not really the sealing ordinance that creates that problem. What creates that problem is the idea of eternal families,
Yeah.
right? Because if you think that you're with your spouse in the eternities and then you just have multiple spouses, the question of what would be those relationships. We just imagined ceilings are not necessary for there to be eternal relationships in the eternities. You still have the problem. Uh,
Right.
so
Yeah.
that problem is not really created by the sealing ordinances. And I don't know, like I have no answer to that problem.
Yeah.
That is a problem that exists because of the confluence of the fact that people can have multiple marriages in mortality and they can have
Yeah.
multiple happy marriages in mortality. And then those marriages could happen in the eternities.
Yeah.
And the fact that you could have some asymmetric theology in which men are polygamous in the eternities and women aren't, like, I don't find that at all. That doesn't solve the problem for me.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
and there were women that had multiple ceilings before, and there's lots of women that had multiple ceilings. And so then we don't know what is going to happen with those.
Yeah.
So I don't know that on the who am I with in the eternities, I don't think it's
Yeah.
possible to give a clear answer to that question because of the
Yeah.
just the nature of the interaction. I will say that what that suggests to me, and the reason that I then still find the idea of sealing ordinances really compelling, is that I actually think that there's something going on in that older kingdom theology that is largely sort of fallen out of practice, and we don't talk about it. But the idea that part of what we're doing with the sealing ordinances is we're just creating these sacred priesthood networks. And there's something about being enmeshed in a net of sacred priesthood networks that is itself part of what it means for there to be salvation. So I'm inclined to think maybe the answer is that all of the sealings are valid in the eternities, but we just need to rethink a little bit what validity means,
Mm.
and that they can be valid in the sense that they are part of the connections that sort of knits the human race together, and we're
Yeah.
being sealed up to salvation. So you go back to the very earliest way in which Joseph Smith talked about sealings. That doesn't give you an answer to who are you going to be with in the eternities? Is there
Yeah.
going to be polygamy in the eternities or something like that? But it does suggest that even though we can't, in an easy way, map our sealing practices onto some family structure that would be our uniquely happy family structure in the eternities because we have inconsistent visions of what a happy family structure in the eternities looks like. It doesn't
Yeah.
follow from that that the ceilings are a waste or that they don't mean anything or that they're irrelevant. I think they are creating happy family structures in the eternities in some sense. Like I'm comfortable with the idea of eternal families, even though I think it creates really hard, perhaps unanswerable theological questions. So I'm not rejecting that,
Yeah.
but I am saying that ceilings may be doing more than that. And so then I look back over the history of it, of all of these different practices and ordinances and theology, and I say, this is God working in the world. God gave this
Yes.
power, the sealing power. This sealing power can bless people's lives by creating connections between people, and those connections with other people needs to endure into the eternities for there to be salvation. And this ritual and priesthood power is part of doing that.
Yeah.
And so then, like, I'm not quite sure exactly which version of the theology is exactly right. And none of these
Yeah.
versions of these theologies are just simplifications that I've done to try and make sense of the history. But I think that there's some core power that God is working out in the world through the sealing ordinances. And so that's how I am comfortable going to the temple, even
Yeah.
though I know there are all these complications with the rules and the way the rules have developed over time and the way that the rules crystallize certain theological understandings that I no longer accept. And I don't even think most members of the church would accept and might not even be aware of what the previous
Yeah.
theological understanding is that was crystallized. And we're just sort of in the middle of a practice that's developed over time. And there's a certain messiness in the practice. And there's a certain messiness in our understanding of the practice, but that doesn't mean that it's not God
Yeah.
working in the world.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I that has felt like my takeaway. Like, this is human, this is divine. I love the way you put it, that maybe every sealing is part of this work of connecting this human family. And we are trying, like, we're trying to figure out how to do this well, and it's going to keep on changing. And it feels like I can let go of the things that I cannot make work, and I can stick with this version that feels so godly, that feels like the most generous God is just inviting us in and connecting to God, but also connecting to each other. And we're doing the human part of trying to figure out what that looks like. And sometimes it gets so messy and doesn't feel like God. And I really appreciate that orientation, that it's okay to let some of that go. And there can still be something really godly in this project, and it can still be ours to do. And that's what we're working out. And that this wrestle and this discomfort is part of that work. So thank you so much. I feel like it's just a really powerful perspective. And it's something I want to feel some peace around. And I think this is a way forward to let things be imperfect and trust that God can even be in that. Like God can be in the wrestle and the working out and also the letting go. So thank you so much. Thank you for your work, but also just for wrestling, right now, like in the conversation. I just really appreciate your openness to look at the pain and look at the history and figure out what it means for us and our families right now.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Nate Oman. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to leave us a review wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening.